The Battle of Berlin. Hitler's suicide. The Battle of Berlin was not merely a clash of steel between armies. It was the final reckoning, where the ashes of a 12-year empire were swept into the ruins of history. It was the place where hundreds of thousands took their last breath, and where the dying scream of a civilization echoed for the final time. In those fateful days of April 1945, as the Red Army's final artillery shell shattered the dome of the Reichstag, the entire world seemed to hold its breath, and Europe heard the last cry of a relentless 6-year war. But how did a desperate metropolis, defended by the elderly and the young, collapse so swiftly before the unstoppable steel will of the Red Army? Why did the German army's final hope crumble under the crushing weight of the Soviet offensive? In this analysis, we uncover the hidden strategies behind the Battle of Berlin, its blood-stained turning points, and the indelible mark it carved into world history. Fasten your seatbelts. We're heading straight to the heart of the Third Reich's last fortress. Date: April 16th, May 2nd, 1945. Location: Berlin, the heart of Germany and the final bastion of the Nazi regime. Belligerents: the Soviet Red Army versus Nazi Germany. Outcome: Soviet victory, the fall of Germany's capital, and shortly after, the end of the war in Europe. This was not just a battle written in steel and gunpowder. It was the collision between the Red Army's relentless thirst for vengeance and Hitler's delusional last stand. The ultimate reckoning where an empire finally collapsed. Battlefield analysis. The first rule of every war is simple: know the terrain. But in Berlin, the battlefield moved into the very heart of the city, redefining every advantage and disadvantage from the ground up. The opening clashes erupted along the Oder and Neisse rivers at the Seelow Heights, Berlin's eastern gateway. This relatively dry and hilly region served as a natural barrier against the Red Army's rapid advance. The Germans entrenched themselves deeply into these elevations, creating layered defensive positions. The Wehrmacht's final major trench line before the capital itself. Yet once the fighting breached the city limits, the nature of the war transformed completely. Wide boulevards, thick concrete buildings, interconnected subway tunnels, and barricaded streets turned every block, every structure, into an impenetrable fortress for the Germans. This urban maze became the single greatest factor in undermining the Soviet Army's overwhelming firepower. Inside the city, Soviet tank maneuverability was drastically reduced, and artillery, their most devastating weapon, lost much of its effectiveness. As in Stalingrad and other brutal urban campaigns, the Red Army was forced into slow, costly, house-to-house assaults. Brutal, intimate combat that consumed soldiers on both sides. Overall assessment: the Seelow Heights may have offered the Germans a brief tactical reprieve, but Berlin's dense and labyrinthine urban landscape became the true heart of their defense. This shattered city gave the defenders one final desperate chance to resist the vast Soviet tide crashing upon it. The comparison of forces on the battlefield had already sealed the outcome on paper. In Berlin, a collapsing empire faced the military machine of a rising superpower, and the difference between them was staggering. Force comparison. The Red Army entered this final operation with roughly 2.5 million troops. This immense manpower was backed by a thunderous barrage of nearly 42,000 artillery pieces and mortars, and a crushing armored fist of more than 6,250 tanks. Above them, over 7,500 Soviet aircraft dominated the skies, ensuring total air superiority. Their plan was brutally simple: encircle the city from all directions in a ring of steel and crush it under sheer firepower. Opposing them stood the German defense, a fragmented force of about 450,000 men, made up of irregular units, elderly conscripts, teenagers, and the last fanatical remnants of the SS. Their 9,300 artillery pieces and roughly 1,500 remaining armored vehicles were meaningless against the Soviets' overwhelming superiority, more than 4 times the firepower. The Luftwaffe, once feared across Europe, had ceased to exist in any real capacity. The skies over Berlin belonged entirely to the Red Air Force. The numbers screamed a merciless truth. In manpower, artillery, and air power, the Soviets possessed absolute dominance. The fate of Berlin and of the Third Reich was mathematically sealed long before the first shot was ever fired. Preparation phase. Wars are often won or lost long before the first bullet is fired, in command rooms, on maps, and in the minds of generals. For Berlin, the outcome had already been written during the preparation phase, in the war rooms of Moscow and the underground corridors of the Führer bunker. The Red Army's preparations and high command. For this final victory, the Soviets crafted an ambitious plan, an unrelenting encirclement operation designed to crush Berlin in an unstoppable vice. The capital would be seized through a rapid, 3-front assault, trapping the city in a ring of steel. The main command of this vast machine rested with Marshal Georgy Zhukov of the First Belarusian Front, a commander who had proven the horrors and the genius of total war on countless battlefields. At his side were Marshal Ivan Konev, renowned for his tactical brilliance, and Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky, a seasoned strategist of precision and discipline. Their flawless coordination, backed by an immense logistical network, became the key to victory. Zhukov's decision to launch a direct assault on the Silo Heights, despite catastrophic losses, accelerated the operation's timeline and ultimately sealed Berlin's fate. Nazi Germany's preparations and high command. On the German side, resistance was born entirely out of desperation. Their sole objective was to delay the inevitable long enough to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies. At the top of this doomed defense stood Adolf Hitler, isolated in his underground bunker, detached from reality, issuing increasingly irrational and impossible orders. General Gotthard Heinrici, commanding the outer defenses, and General Helmuth Weidling, leading Berlin's final stand, were among the few competent officers left. Yet even they were bound to obey the delusional directives coming from the Führer bunker. The greatest weakness of the German command structure was its blind loyalty to the Führer. That loyalty condemned its generals to decisions utterly divorced from the battlefield's grim reality, decisions that would lead the Third Reich to its inevitable end. The course of the battle. The Battle of Berlin unfolded like a grim ritual, precise, unrelenting, and soaked in blood. Day by day, hour by hour, its most decisive moments carved their place into history. April 16th, thunder and assault. Dawn. The Red Army unleashed one of the most intense artillery bombardments in human history. From Zhukov's First Belarusian Front and Konev's First Ukrainian Front, a storm of fire erupted across the Oder River and the Silo Heights. Tens of thousands of artillery barrels thundered in unison, shaking the earth itself. This bombardment was designed not only to shatter the German defensive lines, but also to annihilate the morale of those who still dared to hold them. The beginning of the end was announced, with the sound of hell itself. April 17th to 19th, the Hell of Silo Heights. The first and most critical turning point of the battle took place on these blood-soaked hills. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's forces met the layered defenses masterfully prepared by General Gotthard Heinrici. The Germans fought with a brilliance born of desperation, inflicting heavy casualties on the Soviets. Yet the Red Army's relentless determination and sheer numerical superiority couldn't be stopped. After 3 days of ferocious knife-edge combat, Soviet troops finally broke through the German lines. That breach sealed Berlin's fate. The road to the capital now lay wide open. April 25th. The Iron Ring closes. Just 6 days after the fall of Silo, Soviet troops reached their final objectives. The Red Army completed its encirclement of Berlin, forming an iron ring around the city. Inside, chaos reigned. Fighting erupted in every street. Sniper ambushes, house-to-house combat, and brutal skirmishes, even in the dark subway tunnels. Berlin had become an inescapable nightmare of urban warfare, where survival was measured in minutes and meters. April 30th. 2 tragic moments. Afternoon. The emotional and psychological climax of the war arrived. Elite Soviet troops stormed the Reichstag, and around 2 p.m., they raised the iconic red flag over its shattered dome, the symbol of victory and vengeance. For the Soviet Union, this was not just triumph. It was the ultimate act of retribution. Moments later, only a few hundred meters away in the Führer bunker, Adolf Hitler took his own life alongside Eva Braun. His death marked not merely the end of a man, but the final collapse of the delusional dream of the Third Reich. May 2nd, the beginning of silence. Berlin's commander, General Helmuth Weidling, realized that further resistance would bring nothing but meaningless bloodshed. He finally issued the order to surrender. One by one, the last pockets of resistance fell. The remaining SS fanatics were subdued. After weeks of destruction, the guns of Berlin fell silent at last. One of the bloodiest urban battles in human history had ended, and silence reclaimed the city that had once echoed with the roar of empire. Strategic and psychological effects. Strategic impact. The fall of Berlin marked the definitive end of World War II in Europe. Germany's defeat meant unconditional surrender just a week later. For the Soviet Union, it was not merely victory. It was the establishment of dominance over Eastern Europe, laying the geopolitical foundation for the Cold War that would follow. Psychological impact. The human toll was immeasurable. For Germany, it was not only the collapse of its military might, but also the destruction of a national myth, a collective trauma and humiliation. Berlin lay in ruins, its people broken. For the Red Army, it was the culmination of a brutal campaign that had begun at Stalingrad, a victory paid for with oceans of blood. This battle embodied the confrontation between totalitarian fanaticism and the unyielding will of an emerging superpower. The Battle of Berlin was far more than a military engagement. It was the fall of an empire and the birth of a new world order. History will remember it as the clash where the Red Army's overwhelming force crushed the final flames of Nazi fanaticism in the streets of a dying metropolis. It stands as a testament to the horrors of urban warfare, the limits of human endurance, and the ruthless determination of military leadership. So, what do you think? Was Hitler's decision to defend Berlin to the very end pure madness, or a final desperate gamble to divide the Allies? Share your thoughts in the comments below. See you in our next war analysis.